Good morning from Medora, North Dakota. It's Thursday, April 2nd, 2020. I'd like to thank you for joining me here at Teddy Talks, 26 Days with the 26th President. That's what we're calling it here during the month of April. I think we're going to need your suggestions for what to call our May programs. It looks like we will still be in isolation and finding ways to connect with one another. I'm glad that some of you joined us yesterday. We told the thrilling story in Theodore Roosevelt's own words of the April 1st, 1886 capture of the boat thieves. And if you stayed with me from beginning to end, you showed a great deal of patience, and that was a long reading. I'll read today from some of what Theodore Roosevelt spoke to us on April 2nd, 1903 and April 2nd, 1908. All three of these messages were given by Theodore Roosevelt to college audiences, either at the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, or at the White House. And so I'm so very glad that you're with us again in this format. I hope that you'll use the opportunity to send some questions and comments along. If we have any complications technologically, we'll realize that this too shall pass. We'll work on those. I'm looking forward to seeing some of your comments later today, answering your questions, perhaps the day following. That might be the best format to use. And so yesterday, there was one question from my dear friend Rick Stern of Fargo, perhaps the Bison NDSU fan of all. And Rick asked, well, what happened to the boat thieves? I responded that two of the men were convicted, and the third was shown leniency by the court and by Theodore Roosevelt as the arresting officer and the complainant. But I wanted to source something I told you about yesterday, and now I think our visuals are working better with this one camera. This is my favorite book about Roosevelt's ranching days. Indeed, it's called Roosevelt's Ranches. It's by my friend Rolf Sletton. And it's delightful in that it takes so many of the sources that have come about from Theodore Roosevelt's own time through some of the great writings done since. But what I really enjoy about Rolf's book is it's a wonderful compendium of the stories of Roosevelt's time here, and it's got some wonderful graphics. So if I may, we'll see how this works. Here are some photographs that Theodore Roosevelt staged. The men who are hiding their faces are actually Wilmot Dow and Bill Sewell himself, and so they aren't really the boat thieves. And as Rolf points out, Theodore Roosevelt never claimed that they were authentic photos, but they were the basis then for Frederick Remington's sketches that were then published with Theodore Roosevelt's telling of the story. Here's what Rolf has to say about what happened to the boat thieves at the trial. For stealing Roosevelt's boat, Finnegan and Bernstead were sentenced to serve 25 months in the new territorial penitentiary in Bismarck. By the time of the sentencing, Roosevelt had decided not to pursue the charges against Pfeffenbaugh. He told the judge that the old German was the kind of person who was not capable of doing either much good or much harm, and so the charges against Pfeffenbaugh were summarily dismissed. The old man thanked Roosevelt profusely. Roosevelt later told Bill Sewell this was the first time he had ever had a man say thank you for calling him a fool. And then Rolf goes on to say that by the late fall of 1887, Finnegan from prison sent Roosevelt a letter, a very conversant sort of letter, and added a P.S. Should you stop over at Bismarck this fall on your Western tour, make a call to the prison. I should be glad to see you. That there was some sort of bond and unity forged by the men, even though one was the sheriff and the others were the arrested boat thieves. When you come to Medora, stop by the Western Edge bookstore, one of the finest stores west of the Mississippi for books, and spend a morning or an afternoon in that store and get a copy of Rolf Sletton's Roosevelt's Ranches. I mentioned that we might start as well each day with a little bit of this day in history. It's April 2nd, and a long, long time ago, in the year 742, well over 1,200 and nearly 80 years ago, the birth of Charlemagne. And now in history, we also know Charlemagne as Charles the First, Charles the Great, starting in 768, inheriting from his father, and then an untimely death of his brother. He was king of the Franks, and through 4 decades and more of nearly ceaseless war, king of the Lombards, the emperor of the Romans, and his reign would be known as the Carolingian Empire. Some in history call him the father of Europe. Theodore Roosevelt studied the life of Charlemagne. And indeed, we have 2 original sources on the life of Charlemagne. One was by the monk and courtier Einhard, the other by Notker, the stammerer. Einhard was actually a friend and servant of Charlemagne. I've got an English translation of what was written in the 800s, but Theodore Roosevelt, you'll often find that when he writes about books that he's had with him or what he might be reading on a hunting trip, he was reading Einhard's The Life of Charlemagne. But unlike me reading the modern translation, Theodore Roosevelt was reading in the Old French. What a fascinating fellow, Theodore Roosevelt. I'm speaking today about college students and Theodore Roosevelt's message to college students. One of my dear college friends at the University of the South, Sewanee, Tennessee, was Roland Knoll, himself the son of a scholarly history professor at the University of the South. And this is famous. This is the medieval painting, or the Renaissance painting, perhaps, at the death of Roland. That's Charlemagne visiting Roland. Roland, a knight of Charlemagne's court who fought a rear guard action, saved the empire from defeat. And so today, college is a special thing. The friendships that we establish there are so important in our lives. So to Roland Knoll, my late friend, today's program dedicated to Roland and to all of my fellow students at Sewanee. On April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson addressed the United States Congress requesting a declaration of war against Germany, declaring in part, "The right is more precious than peace." Theodore Roosevelt held his tongue in the immediate time period there. He was very interested in serving in that war and wasn't going to castigate Wilson a great deal at that time. But it was much to the disgust of Theodore Roosevelt that nearly 2 years prior, Wilson had said that sometimes a people can be too proud to fight. And he had said that after the sinking by the Germans of the British commercial liner, the Lusitania. And 1,200 perished. 128 Americans perished. When Theodore Roosevelt eventually, in April 1917, went to the White House to see Wilson to request his commission, his ability to serve in the United States Army, Wilson looked at him and through him and said, "President Roosevelt, we now have professional soldiers to do that work." And so it was the youngest, Quentin, who said, "It is rather up to us to do what Father preaches." And all 4 boys went and fought in World War I. Daughter Ethel, daughter-in-law Eleanor, Ted Jr.'s wife, Ethel's husband, Dr. Derby. So many went to France while they could. The 2 ladies going to be nurses before Congress adopted legislation to prohibit spouses from going to the front lines. So April 2nd in history. Let's go ahead and proceed with some messages from Theodore Roosevelt to the college students. But first, acknowledging that many of you are now distance learning, homeschooling for the younger ones. Theodore Roosevelt and his 3 siblings, older sister Anna, a younger brother, Elliot, and youngest daughter, Corinne. They were all homeschooled in a sense of having their lessons at home. Theodore Roosevelt and his brother being tutored eventually as well. But those home lessons were so very invaluable. So I hope that this will help your home lessons a bit. Theodore Roosevelt himself then matriculated and became a college student himself in 1876, joining the freshman class at Harvard College, now Harvard University, Cambridge, Mass. He himself, to paraphrase, said he did not learn much of practical value at Harvard, but felt it was his own fault, perhaps, that he had not applied himself properly. He was quite the student, whereas most of the Boston Brahmins leisurely strolled back and forth to class and were perhaps many of them lazy in their studies. As Theodore Roosevelt implied, most of his classmates major in the issue of nightlife across the Charles River in Boston. Theodore Roosevelt himself, it was written, might likely hear this in his class from a professor. Now see here, Roosevelt, I'm teaching this class. Let's say, I think Theodore Roosevelt got everything he could out of his time at Harvard, including shortly thereafter his first bride, Alice. And there a little context, too, as to why we're coming to you from Medora. Theodore Roosevelt first came to the Badlands in September of 1883 to hunt a bison bull. He was building a home for himself and for his wife and hoped for a growing family when he came and got that bison bull with the assistance of Joe Ferris. And before he returned to New York, he purchased 450 head of cattle and hired Joe's brother, Sylvain Ferris, and William Merrifield to run his nascent cattle ranching operation at Chimney Butte, where that winter Ferris and Merrifield built the Maltese Cross or Chimney Butte cabin, which you can now visit at the South Visitors Center to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, or do so when we're all up and running again in the summer and fall. It was then the following year that Theodore Roosevelt returned and established the Elkhorn Ranch, which was the beginning of the story yesterday on the capture of the boat thieves. In between, there was tragedy. Theodore Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt, of whom Theodore Roosevelt said he was the greatest man he ever knew. Theodore Roosevelt's father died quickly and suddenly of stomach cancer during February of Theodore Roosevelt's sophomore year at Harvard. Part of his healing process that fall and the following year was to go to the Northwoods of Maine, and there with Sewell and Dow, climb Katahdin and hunt and hike and drag the Penobscot. And Theodore Roosevelt's tutor, Arthur Cutler, told Sewell on their first meeting to watch out, that Theodore Roosevelt would rather work himself to death than to give up. And Sewell didn't think much of that scrawny sophomore, junior, entering junior at that point from Harvard, but became quite impressed, to the point where the men joined Theodore Roosevelt in '84 to help establish the Elkhorn Ranch. But on February 12th, in the late night on February 12th, Theodore Roosevelt's young bride, Alice, they married on Teddy's birthday, October 27th, 1880, right after, in the fall after Theodore Roosevelt's college graduation. He tried Columbia Law School for a while, but then became an elected member of the New York General Assembly. And it was there that on February 13th, 1884, Theodore Roosevelt received a telegram that in the night before, Alice Lee Roosevelt had given birth to a daughter. Congratulations were all about, but then a second and ominous telegram came, and that telegram sent young Theodore Roosevelt racing to New York City, where on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, in the early part of the day, unexpectedly, and of typhoid fever, Theodore Roosevelt's mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, died of typhoid fever. And that afternoon, in his arms, and she in a coma, suffering from Bright's disease, a condition of the kidney now treatable by modern medicine, Theodore Roosevelt's young bride, Alice, died. Of the twin funeral 2 days later, Theodore Roosevelt's friend Owen Wister wrote, "Theodore knows neither what he does nor says." So from 1884 through 86, 87, those active ranching years, Theodore Roosevelt came here to the Badlands and he healed through hard work and ranching. There's nothing so good for the inside of a man or a woman as the outside of a horse. He wrote, he read, and he was a man of faith. Surely, I think himself had written that he would not have survived all of the tragedy and heartache in his life, but for his faith. So, Theodore Roosevelt said of this region, it was where the romance of his life began. And in Fargo in 1911, told the people there he would have never been president, but for his experiences in North Dakota. So that's why we're coming to you from Medora. And this TEDdy Talk is dedicated to the students of the class of 2020. Theodore Roosevelt gave us some messages to college students during his lifetime, and I'd like to share some of those messages with you. One additional note, perhaps second only to Abraham Lincoln. As president, Theodore Roosevelt referenced the Bible in his comments, speeches, and official papers, and he does so in 2 of the 3 speeches that I'll be referencing today. At the University of Chicago, TR alludes to, quote, a sage who said that it was easier to be a harmless dove than a wise serpent, unquote. Of course, the reference is Matthew 10:16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. At the White House speech, April 2nd, 1908, to the Intercollegiate League, Theodore Roosevelt counsels the students in part to avoid being, quote, the mere tool and representative of those who make of mammon their God. That's Matthew 6:24. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Mammon, specifically the Syrian god of riches, and here figuratively the worship of wealth. TR would have assumed, and correctly so, that any well-educated college audience would, for the greatest part, be very familiar with their Bibles. He himself, later in life, would say, a thorough knowledge of the Bible is worth more than a college education. So perhaps it's implied by this message this morning. We've got a lot of time to read, and there's a lot of good reading to be done in the good book. I'll read the speeches in turn, maybe a little note in front of each. At the University of Chicago, when TR mentions President Harper, he is speaking of University of Chicago President William Rainey Harper. My friends in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, and I hope some of my old Palatine High School classmates are watching in, will recognize William Rainey Harper Community College. Harper was one of the nation's earliest and most respected advocates of what would become the community college movement in the United States. I'm proud to say that my mother, Joan Elizabeth Prager Wiegand, was an award-winning art student late in life, after 5 children, a non-traditional student in her late 30s at William Rainey Harper Community College. TR mentions Dr. Judson, that's political science professor Henry Platt Judson, who would succeed Harper as the second of University of Chicago's presidents. And together the 2 men were evenly split the helmsmanship at the University of Chicago for its first 33 years, from 1890, a new university, until 1923. So April 2nd, 1903, Chicago, Illinois, at the laying of the cornerstone of the new law school at the university. Mr. President, men and women of the university, and you, my fellow citizens, people of the great city of the West, I am glad indeed to have the chance of being with you this afternoon to receive this degree at the hands of President Harper and in what I have to say there is little that I can do to save to emphasize certain parts made in the address of Dr. Judson. I speak to you of this university, to you who belong to the institution, the creation of which has so nobly rounded out the greater career of mercantile enterprise and prosperity which Chicago not merely embodies, but of which in a peculiar sense the city stands as symbolical. It is of vast importance to our well-being as a nation that there should be a foundation deep and broad of material well-being. No nation can amount to anything great unless the individuals composing it have so worked with the head or with the hand for their own benefit, as well as for the benefit of their fellows in material ways, that the sum of the national prosperity is great. But that alone does not make true greatness, or anything approaching true greatness. It is only the foundation for it, and it is the existence of institutions such as this, above all the existence of institutions turning out citizens of the type which I know you turn out, that stands as one of the really great assets of which a nation can speak when it claims true greatness. From this institution you will send out scholars, and it is a great and a fine thing to send out scholars to add to the sum of productive scholarship. To do that is to take your part in doing one of the great duties of civilization. But you will do more than that, for greater than the school is the man, and you will send forth men, men who will scorn what is base and ignoble, men of high ideals who yet have the robust sense necessary to allow for the achievement of the high ideal by practical methods. It was also a sage who said that it was easier to be a harmless dove than a wise serpent. Now, the aim and production of citizenship must not be merely the production of harmless citizenship. Of course, it is essential that you should not harm your fellows. But if, after you are through with life, all that can be truthfully said of you is that you did not do any harm, it must also be truthfully added that you did no particular good. Remember that the commandment had the two sides, to be harmless as doves and wise as serpents, to be moral in the highest and broadest sense of the word, to have the morality that doers and that does and fears, the morality that can suffer, and the morality that can achieve results, to have that, and coupled with it to have the energy, the power to accomplish things which every good citizen must have if his citizenship is to be of real value to the community. Dr. Judson said in his address today that the things that we need are elemental. We need to produce not genius, not brilliancy, but the homely, commonplace, elemental virtues. The reason we won in 1776, the reason that in the great trial from 1861 to 1865, this nation rang true metal, was because the average citizen had in him the stuff out of which good citizenship has been made from time immemorial. Because he had in him courage, honesty, common sense, brilliancy, and genius. Yes, if we can have them in addition to the other virtues. If not, if brilliant genius comes without the accompaniment of the substantial qualities of character and soul, then it is a menace to the nation. If it comes in addition to those qualities, then, of course, we can get the great general leader. We get the Lincoln. We get the man who can do more than any common man. But without it, much can be done. The men who carried musket and saber in the armies of the East and the West through the 4 grim years which at last saw the sun of peace rise at Appomattox had only the ordinary qualities, but they were pretty good ordinary qualities. They were the qualities which, when possessed as those men possessed them, made in their sum what we call heroism. And what those men need to have in time of war, we must have in time of peace. If we are to make this nation what she shall ultimately become, if we are to make this nation, in very fact, the great republic, the greatest power upon which the sun has ever shone, and no quality is enough. First of all, honesty. And again, remember, I am using the word in its broadest signification. Honesty, decency, clean living at home, clean living abroad, fair dealing in one's own family, fair dealing with the public. And honesty is not enough. If a man is never so honest, but is timid, there is nothing to be done with him. In the Civil War, you needed patriotism in the soldier, but if the soldier had patriotism, yet felt compelled to run away, you could not win the fight with him. Together with honesty, you must have the second of the virile virtues, courage. Courage to dare, courage to stand against the wrong and to fight aggressively and vigorously for the right. And if you have only honesty and courage, you may yet be an entirely worthless citizen. An honest and valiant fool has but a small place of usefulness in the body politic. With honesty, with courage, must go common sense, ability to work with your fellows, ability when you go out of the academic halls to work with the men of this nation, the men of millions who have not gotten academic training, who will accept your leadership on just one consideration, and that is if you show yourself in the rough work of actual life fit and able to lead, and only so. You need honesty, you need courage, and you need common sense. Above all, you need it in the work to be done in the building, the cornerstone of which we laid today, the law school, out of which are to come the men who, at the bar and on the bench, make and construe, and in construing, make the laws of this country. The men who must teach by their actions all our people that this is, in fact, essentially a government of orderly liberty under the law. Men and women, you, the graduates of this university, you, the undergraduates, upon you rests a heavy burden of responsibility. Much has been given to you. Much will be expected of you. A great work lies before you. If you fail in it, you discredit yourselves. You discredit the whole cause of education. You can succeed and will succeed if you work in the spirit of the words and deeds of President Harper and of those men who I have known so well, who are in your faculty today. I thank you for having given me the chance to speak to you. My goodness, he comes right between the eyes, doesn't he? I'll carry on while we're in the spirit. April 2nd, that same very day, to the student body at Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago, up on the lake. The president, in his remarks, the president mentioned his Northwestern University president, Edmund James. The mayor is Evanston Mayor John T. Barker. Mr. President, and you, my fellow alumni, the first degree of laws that I ever received was from your university, and I am doubly glad to have the chance of coming here 10 years later to meet you and wish you well. One word before I speak, especially to college men and women, and that is a word, Mr. Mayor, about the city of Evanston, to say how glad I am to be here in this beautiful city, how glad I have been to see your people, and especially the children. And it seems to me, Mr. Mayor, that they are all right in point both of quality and quantity. And I wish to state in all seriousness that a deficiency in either cannot be atoned for by excellence in the other respect. And now a word, and only a word, to you on the college here. The president has said that still, after 2,000 years, it is a subject of discussion as to exactly how much a college education does for a man or a woman. It seems to me that the explanation why that is still a question is, after all, simple. If either the boy or the girl, the man or the woman, has not got the right stuff in him or her, you cannot bring it out. But if you have got the right stuff in you, why, then, surely, it is the veriest truism to say that the better your training, the better will be the kind of work that you can do. This, above all, to the young men going out, each to do a man's work in the world. And if he has not that purpose, he is of no use whatsoever in our American life. We have no room for the idler here. We have no room for the man who merely wishes to lead a pleasant life. If that is all he desires, he can never count in American work. If the man has not got in him the desire to count, the desire to do good work in whichever line he adopts, then scant is our use for him. But if he has got in him, then all I ask him to remember is this. All that I ask each one of you here to remember is this, that if you go from this university, from any university, feeling merely that your course here has given you special privileges, if you feel that it has put you in a class apart, you will fail in life. If you feel, on the other hand, that the very fact of your having had special advantages imposes upon you special responsibilities, makes it specially incumbent upon you to show that you can do your duty with peculiar excellence, if you approach life in that spirit, the university training will have done much for you. We need all the training for mind that can be given. We need all the training for body that can be given. I welcome every form of rough, vigorous, athletic sports. Some of the cheering this morning made me feel as if I was looking on at a good football game. I welcome all forms of manly, vigorous, rough exercise. The best kind of work that can be done is such as is done by your life-saving crew here. But all universities cannot be placed beside a lake where there is a chance for a crew. They are going to do the best they can with the 9 and the 11. Now, it is a great thing to have a safe and a strong and a vigorous body. It is better thing to have a sage, a strong and a vigorous mind. But best of all is to have that which is partly made up of both, and partly made up of something higher and better. Character. That is what counts. That is what counts, and the main good that can be done to you after all in a university such as this is to give you what I am certain universities do give, character, a fine and high type of citizenship. That is what we must strive to produce in our universities. Physical strength? Yes. Mental strength? Yes, even more than physical. But above all, let us strive to develop that for the lack of which neither bodily prowess nor mental capacity can atone, the quality of the soul, of the heart, the qualities of strength, of courage, of sweetness, which we group together when we say that a man or woman has character. I thank you for listening to me today. And finally, April 2nd, 1908, a little speech titled Some Ideals of Public Life and Their Practical Application to Politics. These were given at the White House to the delegates to the convention of Intercollegiate League of Political Clubs. According to the Columbia University newspaper, there were representatives from Columbia, Yale, Cornell, Princeton, Pennsylvania, Harvard, Amherst, Williams, Brown, Syracuse, New York University, Chicago, Michigan, and Dartmouth. And they were presented to the president by Mr. Henry Wyans Jessup, a class of 82 Princeton man and New York attorney. But according to the president's comments, there must have been additional delegates from other colleges, as he mentions the North Dakota delegates. This is very brief. Mr. Jessup and gentlemen, I need hardly say how sincerely glad I am to meet this particular delegation. I welcome all of you, and the rest must not mind my saying a special word of greetings to the delegates from North Dakota. I was a North Dakota man myself at one time. One of the valuable features of such a meeting as that of yesterday is that it brings together the young men of college training from different sections of the country to train them at bottom. Our interests are the same. I shall say but a few words to you. You know what my beliefs are. You know that I feel that the college man has a special burden of responsibility upon him, because to him has been given much, and from him we have a right to expect much in return. Every college man gets from his college something he cannot return to her, and no American citizen should ever receive something for which he cannot give a fair equivalent. And you cannot give a fair equivalent to your alma mater, except in one way, and that is the manner in which you reflect credit upon her by what you do to add to the sum of the nation's achievement. Of course, there are certain elemental things to remember. Under the conditions of American life, none of you can accomplish anything unless you come out imbued with a genuine democracy of spirit. I do not mean by that that you should have any demagogy about you. Just exactly as the parlor socialist type is without exception the least attractive type, not the most dangerous. Of course, there is a certain element of danger, but it is a dangerous to a small degree, and it is ridiculous to a very large degree. So it is peculiarly reprehensible for the college man to play the demagogue on the one hand, and on the other hand to become the mere tool and representative of those who make of Mammon their god, who would teach us that American life exists primarily not for the spiritual and moral betterment of our people, but that some people can make great fortunes and the bulk of the people share the crumbs that fall from the tables of those that make the great fortunes. We have a right to expect that you college men will be leaders against both of the thoroughly unhealthy types that tend to the demoralization of American political life. After all, while there is an infinite variety of detail in the problems that generations successfully face, the fundamental quality necessary in order that these problems may be faced are always the same. What we have to strive for is the betterment of social, political, and civic conditions by bringing a little nearer the day when justice and truth and courage shall prevail, when each man shall deal justly by his brother as he is brought in contact with him, and when there shall be immeasurable equality of opportunity for each man to show the stuff there is in him. Theodore Roosevelt's Messages to College Students, April 2nd, 1903 in Chicago and Evanston, Illinois, and in 1908 at the White House. To the class of 2020, we know that you're going to conclude your college year in a way that none ever have done before. We're looking forward to you coming out into the workforce. If any of you would like to talk about opportunities that we have here in Medora, we're going to put on a Medora musical. We're going to serve folks at the Rough Riders Hotel and the Pitchfork Steak Fondue. I'm going to take people out into Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and together we're going to visit the Elkhorn Ranch. Maybe I can read to you there. With a great deal of thanks to everyone at the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation, most especially my colleagues Justin, Kaylee, Dylan, who have helped me to understand some of this technology. I'll continue to strive to do a better job on these morning gatherings, these Teddy Talks. We've got 24 more to get through in the month of April. Tomorrow, Friday, April 3rd, we are going to commemorate the arrival here, previous to the naming of Medora for his own wife, when the Marquis de Moore came to Little Missouri, the station name of the fairly newly constructed station as the Northern Pacific was being built west into Montana Territory. On April 3rd, the Marquis de Moore came to stake his claim along the Little Missouri. And then some months later, a man of the same age, they both 25 years old, Theodore Roosevelt would follow him for that bison hunt. They would become neighbors. I'm going to have some comments about the neighborly and sometimes difficult relations between the Marquis de Moore and young Theodore Roosevelt. I'm also going to read from a speech that on April 3rd, 1903, on that great Western trip coming out across the country, Theodore Roosevelt spoke in Waukesha, Wisconsin, spoke about foreign relations, and used that analogy of good neighbors in his comments. So do keep your comments and questions coming via the Facebook pages, both at Theodore Roosevelt, the Teddy Roosevelt Show, and at Medora ND. Those two Facebook pages. Hopefully, if I hit the right button, we were able to co-broadcast across those two Facebook pages. I enjoyed your comments yesterday. I think we had people watching from over 20 states across the country. It's not about me. It's not even really about Theodore Roosevelt. It's about all of us being in this together, the American people. Stay safe. Stay home. Stay well. God bless our doctors and nurses and everybody on the front lines. We'll see you here tomorrow, 7 a.m. Mountain, 9 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Central, 6 a.m. Pacific for Teddy Talks. 26 days with the 26th president. Have a great day.